So, Aidan, I couldn't think of how to change this joke and still make it funny. So, I'm going to give you two different setups and then the same punchline for both, okay?
Let's go.
All right. What do you get when you cross a 100% independent magazine with one that's only for hardcore fanatics of the world's biggest consumer products company? And what do you get when you cross an elephant and a rhino? Elephino. You've got Fun Factor. Two old gamers review old video game magazine reviews. I'm Ty Shelter, he's Aidan Moher, and we're two professional writers who grew up loving the video games and video game magazines of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. Every episode, we take a critical look back on the games media that, for better and for worse, inspired us to do what we do. First, go to funfactorpod.com and subscribe to the show on your podcatcher of choice. Leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your media. Follow us on Blue Sky at FunFactorPod, and please consider becoming a member by supporting us directly at funfactorpod.com. Today's magazine, the very first issue of PSM, 100% independent PlayStation magazine, published by Imagine Media in September 1997. If you look closely in the top right of the corner, you'll see what seems to be the magazine's mascot. It's a big yellow smiley face, like from the 60s, except it's got an eye patch, which has a white star on it over one eye, and then the eyebrow, it's got a slanty eyebrow over the other eye, and then the grin only has one dimple, so it's a smiley face, but with the 90s tude. I think it's to drive home the idea that this is an independent magazine. Like, Aidan, you see the 90s vibe?
I see major 90s vibe, and like the best thing about PSM, the reviews are good, the features were good, the jokes were good. Came with stickers, and the smiley face is also a sticker that you would put on the circular lid of your PlayStation. So your PlayStation would have that 90s tude as well, and you could rep your favorite 100% independent PlayStation magazine at the same time.
Yes. And this is a big sticker right in this one, labeled "Hack Your PlayStation." Aidan, you can hack your PlayStation like a real 90s hacker by putting this sticker on the lid.
I mean, me and my friends had to actually hack our PlayStations because they always stopped working, and we would have to turn them upside down and get pro action replays and use springs, like literally just to play games. So, they were stretching it with the sticker, but hacking your PlayStation was probably my first experience with having to do like console mods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, you could also play certain CDs from certain regions that maybe you weren't supposed to have, or maybe came from certain people's computers and not from a Sony factory. Who knows?
Yeah, my first experience with Final Fantasy Tactics was one of my best friends. His brother-in-law went to Thailand and came back with some early release PlayStation games. So he had Castlevania Symphony of the Night, he had Final Fantasy Tactics, and he played through a bootleg Japanese Final Fantasy Tactics months before it came out in North America in English, and he played through the whole thing. And this is like not just is like the story complex and text heavy, but this is a game with like menus inside of menus inside of menus. And he must have poured 150, 200 hours into Final Fantasy Tactics, playing through it in Japanese way before the US release, the North American release. And so,
incredible.
Like that wasn't something that was possible at all on the pre-CD consoles. And so, the PlayStation and the PSM, era did introduce me to a lot of things that, like were unique to gaming at that time that have become more relevant over time.
Yeah. And so the independent tude was very important because the very next month, October 1997, Sony and Ziff Davis launched the official US PlayStation magazine. The really wild thing is that, according to RetroMags.com, the official US PlayStation magazine was just a rebranded indie also. So there was a PSX, short for PlayStation Experience magazine, that had been running for 17 issues, and then it was acquired by Ziff Davis and Sony. They gave the original editor double the budget and headcount and just slapped the official name on it, and relaunched in October 1997, 1 month after PSM number 1.
I mean, okay, two thoughts here. Can we do more of that? Can we double budget and headcount?
Right,
like for magazines and websites, please? Like, let's go back to that. And second, why would you go with the official US PlayStation magazine with its beautiful official Final Fantasy VII key art when you could go with PSM, the 100% independent PlayStation magazine, with its Final Fantasy art that looked like it was drawn by somebody who had just signed up for a DeviantArt account?
Right. Well, this is what I wanted to talk about, because it feels so 90s to claim this like fierce independence and be owned by a mid-sized publisher that runs lots of sibling publications and still have all of your work be totally captured by super fandom of one company's consumer products. I want to quote PSM editor-in-chief Chris Slate from the intro here. This means more than just tossing out the Nintendo and Saturn reviews. It's a state of mind. PSM is written only for hardcore PlayStation fanatics in a way that's directed exclusively to you. And don't worry, we're completely unofficial. You won't miss out on anything that Sony may not want you to see, and will always be completely unbiased. But then contrast that, editor-in-chief of the official US PlayStation magazine, Wataru Maruyama, says, "I'd like to make it clear to our readers that you will always get our 100% honest opinions about everything and anything. There are no biases for or against anyone just because we're an official PlayStation magazine." It just feels so weird because today's media, obviously print outlets, text outlets, your Polygons and Kotakus and whatever, obviously have journalistic standards. But most media, podcasts, video, streamers, YouTubers, this entire concept is foreign to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like in the era of personality-based, like enthusiast press, it's all about sort of that bias and who you are and what you like, and that's what you're bringing to the table. And it's funny seeing, like an unofficial and an official version of the PlayStation magazine sort of competing for that Nintendo power money.
Yes.
Trying to get into a bit of a pissing match about who is the least biased. And it's like, well, like, then if you don't have biases and you don't have personality and you're not bringing something to the table, like, what are you? You're just going to print press releases without any commentary? And that's a continuing conversation that we still have where, you have conversations about how we need an unbiased games media. And it's like, well, then you're just going to get regurgitated press releases, because what you're actually looking for are trusted sources who can bring their biases and their experiences to the table and provide context and, narrative around what it is about these that works or doesn't work within context of their experiences, which theoretically match up with your own experiences.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it's really interesting that we don't have this now, right? Like what we have is like Nintendo Direct. We have State of Play.
Yeah.
Nobody's going out and buying a Polygon or buying a Kotaku and being like, all right, cool. Now you just crank out in-depth text content, right? They're just kind of leaving that. Then the other thing is I wonder if part of it is just the divorcing from, it's a good thing, right, that we've divorced to some extent games coverage from just raw consumer. Tell me if this is worth my money to buy. Like, let's get this away from just, will this be worth my $60? Because that's what people really cared about, the bias, right? Like, I remember when I was a kid, like Nintendo Power, I could tell, I'm like trying to figure out, is this worth, $60 of my, lawn mowing money or birthday money or whatever. And then I'm sitting here looking at these the ratings and going, I know if this game sucks, they're not going to tell me. Right.
Yeah. I mean, like if something got a 7 in Nintendo Power, you're like, oh, that's like, just because there was that incentive, that sales incentive. It was a, piece of marketing material. I loved it. And the depth that they put into like non-review stuff was fantastic. The access that they had to creators was amazing. But like, as a piece of like critical work, it wasn't something that was necessarily useful compared to the multi-platform magazines, EGM and Game Players and Game Fan and stuff like that, because there was that sales incentive. And we're seeing that now too in modern games media, where you're having places like Walmart start up their own quote unquote independent games journalism platforms, games media platforms, and at the end of the day they're trying to get you to come into Walmart and buy a video game. And so there's how much hands off, how much arm's length pressure is there on them to create certain stuff, and that you were asking the same questions of, official PlayStation Magazine, Nintendo Power, but even stuff like PSM, like they were going to hype up PlayStation, because if they weren't hyping up PlayStation, they weren't growing and maintaining their quote unquote hardcore PlayStation fans, right? Like if they wanted to keep that audience, they needed to convince you that like you could get by with just a PlayStation.
Yeah, and it's funny because the indie, like today's independent media is like truly independent, right? 404, Remap Radio, Aftermath, like these are like truly worker-owned 4 or 5 employee collectives making this content directly beholden to their readers only. Versus here, it's like, okay, well, Imagine Media, which become Future US, was like a multinational publishing company. Like they were small, but like they published a bunch of different video game magazines. Yeah. A lot of the staff, as we'll get to in a second, worked on other magazines before, after, and during this. Just this idea that it's like, oh, this is by for only true hardcore PlayStation fanatics. It's like, well, I mean, it is and it isn't, and they're still beholden to corporate interests, and they're still getting advertising money from all of these, companies, as we'll see. And that's what's really weird to me too, is the idea that you could have like a 20-person staff supported just by one platform's reviews, and therefore one platform's advertising too. These are only companies that are publishing games on PlayStation are going to be published, buying ads in this magazine. You're not going to get Xbox ads. You're not going to get Nintendo ads. You're not going to. So like, it seems wild to me. You can have a podcast about one platform. I don't think you could have a website about one platform.
Yeah. And like for context, at this point, like on the cover, it says 16 pages, every PlayStation code ever. So there was like the volume of games for PlayStation as a brand. All the codes could fit onto 16 pages in a magazine. Yeah. Which is not a lot, right? I mean, like, no. Getting past the idea that this was still when they would print like cheat codes in magazines, but like every PlayStation game, every code for every PlayStation game could fit on 16 pages. Like that's not a lot of games at that point. And so continuing to drive home like the idea that like despite all the uncertainty around PlayStation, all the like, growing pains that a new company entering the space had, they're advertising Final Fantasy VII. This is before Final Fantasy VII sort of like really blew up the PlayStation as, a mainstream console. And so like getting into this space, they were anticipating, growth for the platform, but like that wasn't certain. But they were still, like you say, devoting all of this time and effort and energy to be not just the only PlayStation magazine, but one of at least 2 on the market at that point. And now we can't even sustain a print magazine for every for console, all the games, every game, right? Even if it is like basically a marketing tool from GameStop. Like Game Informer was closed recently, and it served the same purpose. It was a fantastic magazine. Writing for them was great. I got to write one of my favorite stories ever that had no real marketing crossover. It was about fans who do modern, like retro demakes of modern games. So turning something like Elden Ring into like a Super Nintendo game and making a video about it. Like they weren't selling that in stores. There was no way to make money off it. They still created opportunity to tell these stories above and beyond, honestly, what other publications and online publications were offering. But they were ultimately trying to get you into the store to buy games. That isn't even really, sustainable by current capitalistic standards of, growth and profit. We could argue whether those are the wrong metrics to measure something like PSM or Game Informer by. And I think that would be a pretty, we'd both be fairly in favor of the idea that they shouldn't need to, meet growth standards of capitalists, like, shareholders. Sure. But the fact that, you could do this for one magazine and 20 years later, 30 years later, you can't do it for all the, all the games, all the systems out there is just wild. Sucks. It's bad.
Yeah, well, and maybe you couldn't do it then either, because in the end, none of anything we just said mattered. In 2007, Ziff Davis shut down official US PlayStation Magazine. And then PSM, 100% independent PlayStation magazine, acquired the license and became PlayStation, the official magazine.
Sellouts. Absolute sellouts. They're, all of their integrity with the window, right? To be fair, like Chris Slate, who was the editor-in-chief of PSM, like he's like a legit guy who had a big impact on a lot of like 90s gaming mags. So it wasn't like they were, just throwing anybody out there. They went out and got great writers, great editors, a great editor-in-chief with Chris Slate, who I think went on, am I correct that he was working for Nintendo Power for a long time after that?
Yes. Yes. Well, we'll get into that in the next segment. Okay, we'll get there. We'll get there.
I'll back off.
So yeah, we will open up the cover. We'll dig into the masthead, dig into the stories, and eventually we will get to our review of their review of Final Fantasy VII. Hang tight right here on Fun Factor. Welcome back to Fun Factor, where two old gamers review old video game magazine reviews. Of course, we want you to review us. Do we get a full 5.0 in Fun Factor? We'll leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We'll read the best, funniest, kindest, and most entertaining ones on the air. Now, Aidan, I've written like 3 episode scripts of this show with you so far, and already it feels like all my gaming magazines ever were like 2.5, maybe 2.25 magazines in one trench coat.
Yeah. I mean, it was the Wild West back then, and I think we're starting to see around 97, through the late 90s, but definitely into the 2000s, you see a big shift in how sort of gaming mags came together and what they looked like, and you look at what, especially the Ziff crew started doing with EGM and game trailers and 1-Up, and that's when it started to shift into sort of this more... I don't even know what the word is, grown up or mature or whatever isn't really the right word, but just it started with like, in the early to mid 90s, a lot of like kids writing for kids. And then by the late 90s and into the 2000s, that's when these kids who started out as 20-year-olds writing for 14-year-olds, they then had 10 years of experience, right? In that, in that market. And we're just, getting better at understanding how to create compelling, magazines and experiences that weren't just sort of put together to excite a bunch of little kids. The audience started changing a bit too.
Let me get into the numbers real quick. Again, September 1997 issue, first issue ever, debut issue, 113 pages, not counting the 3-page advertisement after. 10 games were reviewed in this magazine, but they had a backlog of 57. So they just slapped a number on every US release up until the launch. Just like for the record, here's what we would give all of these games. Number of systems reviewed for 1, just 1, the PlayStation. We already talked about the pirate mascot lid sticker. Went ahead and gave us a top 25 games of all time. Very interesting. We'll get to that in the flip through, but I want to look at the masthead. Like you said, Chris Slate was a longtime editor for and of the various incarnations of game players. He's the editor-in-chief at launch of PSM. He'd stay there for 10 years, which is an eternity in media. It was then, now it still is. In 2007, he led a future-helmed relaunch of Nintendo Power. So the same publishing company taking over Nintendo Power. He ran that for 5 more years and then took over Mac Life. But when Future hit financial troubles and closed its U.S. operations, he joined Nintendo as senior manager of corporate communications. I think that was 2016. He's still there today. So still, he went, from running Nintendo Power and then just joining Nintendo and running the communication side.
Seems like a pretty good career path to me. I'm
jealous. Also jealous. On the flip side, managing editor Charles Frohman would leave after 1.5 years to run learn2.com, which was kind of like an how-to site. Then he took a content job with AOL and started going to law school on the side. Started practicing employment law in 2005. Never went back to the media business.
Also
smart.
Seems like a smart career path. Yeah. Learn2.com is like the most Web 2.0 website name I can possibly think of.
Right? Incredible.
It's like, and to be clear, it's a 2, like numeral 2.
Yeah, learn
numeral2.com. Amazing.
Now, this is my favorite one. Obviously, we'll have a whole run of this to go through all of these contributors, but I was really interested. Reviews and previews editor Stephen Frost would stay with PSM until 2004. Then he jumped the table and joined EA as an assistant producer. He was there and then at Activision briefly, and then went to Sega as a full producer, had a 9-year run at Sega. And then in 2016, he joined Digital Eclipse as an executive producer. Now he's head of production there. So from journalist to AAA producer to head of production at a studio that specializes in re-releases of games that he covered as a journalist. In this very September 1997 issue, his review section gave Super Street Fighter Collection a 5 out of 5. In 2018, he produced the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection for Digital Eclipse.
I mean, listen, if I worked at Digital Eclipse, my entire career would be focused on getting Chrono Trigger re-released on modern consoles. So I can't blame the guy. He probably just flips through old issues of PSM looking for his 5 out of 5s, brings it to his boss at Digital Eclipse and says, "Found our next game collection." I love it. It's good. That's exactly what I would do. I would just do re-releases of my favorite games.
And why wouldn't we all? Like that's what we're here for. That's what we would love to do. But hey, we've waited long enough. It's time to do the flip through. I liked the graphic design of PSM. If you kind of go through table of contents here, you really see this sort of repeated triangle theme. It looks like the start button, right? So they like highlight all the page numbers, the reviews. There's a few different fonts, but not like 17 different fonts. All of the fonts are legible.
I love how having like 8 fonts is like, a sign of restraint.
At the time that, and again, already mentioned they have the code Bible, they have the backlog with all the reviews, they got a preview section. They put the reviews up front, which is interesting. My favorite in here, the top 25 PlayStation games of all time. Again, September 1997, right? So like, there's like, 50 games.
Determined that there are 67 games, I think.
Yeah.
So it's almost half of them. Yeah.
Yes.
Amazing.
Just super, super quick. Tobal number 1 cracks in at a 16th all time. Don't think that holds throughout the life of the PlayStation. Destruction Derby 2, 10th best PlayStation 1 game of all time, apparently. I don't even remember Destruction Derby. Twisted Metal is 9, to be clear. I don't think Crash.
We got a lot of play out of Twisted Metal. I don't know that one. I'll come to
No. That's what I'm saying. In comparison, I'm like, if Twisted Metal is 9
right.
and Destruction Derby is 10, Destruction Derby 2 is 10. What are we doing?
Hey, Suikoden at number 6.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd put that higher, but putting the PlayStation, its whole thing was 3D graphics, right? And there's a whole thing about how they apocryphal stories about how they refuse to release pixel art games. The fact that they had Suikoden here at number 6, above stuff like Crash Bandicoot and Ridge Racer, is pretty remarkable, frankly. Like, there was somebody there who was like standing for traditional Japanese RPGs and probably fought pretty hard to get Suikoden. They probably wanted it in that top 5, right? But then they got it at 6. I think that's pretty impressive, frankly, for a magazine like.
Yeah, the remainder of the top 5, you got Wipeout XL, Soul Blade, Tekken 2, Tomb Raider, and then Resident Evil. So, I mean, like you tell me which one Suikoden bumps off, but like that's still way, way up there. Very cool. And then, the preview section, Blasto, which fortunately they avoided Next Gen's fate. Blasto, they gave Blasto the full cover. I know at least a couple other magazines gave Blasto the cover.
Yeah, I remember that issue. Yeah.
We tested exactly how independent all of these magazines were when they gave the huge cover spread to Blasto and then had to give it
the Blasto meter.
1-star reviews. Pretty amazing. And like you said, the code backlog is pretty cool. Previews are exciting.
It's got Colony Wars preview and Castlevania Symphony of the Night preview.
Yeah.
Like, a couple of bangers. The early PlayStation was pretty cool. Like, it was a great time to be a gamer. And there's a pretty good spread of previews here. Like when we do talk about being able to maintain a magazine based off one game console, like there's some pretty good stuff coming out for the PlayStation, you know?
Game Day 98, Tomb Raider 2, Bushido Blade, not all of these cached on the premise, right? But Crash Bandicoot 2, it's like, okay, you've got a lot of stuff that you're like, oh, I want to play. Even this Wild Nines, I remember just this art from this magazine and going, this looks super cool. I want to play this. And I don't even know if it came out. I don't remember it at all. But I remember this cover. This. I
remember
preview.
playing the demo of Wild Nines. Actually, it was fun, but I didn't buy it, so it couldn't have been too fun. Death Trap Dungeon. Eidos's follow up to Tomb Raider. There is a character. Like the most egregious like boob armor I've ever seen. It's just like two metal
pasties,
metal
pasties connected by a chain
with like a gigantic chain connecting them, and that's it. And then like what looks like a metal bikini bottom, and the most insane proportions I've ever seen, and which is saying a lot on the PlayStation, because it was like it basically sold itself as the Lara Croft boob machine for 2 years, and this is above and beyond that. This is definitely like it's made by Eidos, and they definitely were like, oh, people like Lara's boobs, let's go 12 out of 10 on boobs
and reader, if you listener, if you're the audio only version, just know that this is like about 50 total polygons, maybe 52. This is very triangular things are happening.
It's a lot of texture work to try to make those bad boys look round.
And so then we've got this big splash preview of Final Fantasy VII, and we'll get into the Final Fantasy VII stuff. And I'm glad they had this, because as we'll get to in a minute, the review isn't that in depth. This big, character by character, they've got, character bios, they've got a lot of the original art, the same pencil art drawings, concept art drawings we've seen a million times, a whole big section on materia, like a pretty decent walkthrough for this. And I need to go back and actually I meant to check the actual publication dates, because I looked at, other Ultra Game Players, their sister magazine that Chris Slate was the editor for before, actually had their October issue be the one that had the Final Fantasy VII review. So I don't know if they prioritized PSM number 1 to have the Final Fantasy VII cover. I don't know if it got out ahead of the others. But yeah, then
this is early, because I'm looking at this preview, the strategy guide, quote unquote, and they're like referring to Makoro Industrial Complex, Makoro Town. Like, so there's somebody who was not using official translations of names.
Correct.
You have what else do you have? You do have Shinra Core Building, but then you've got, as you scroll down, you have, like, after you leave Midgar, the Rock Town, Cannon Town. So Junon they're calling Cannon Town. Aboard the Cannon Town boat. So this is early. This is pre-English. They got for Calm on their map is just called First Town. And so, you are definitely getting somebody who had a Japanese copy of the game,
100%,
who was doing their own, their own localization, their own translation to write this strategy guide. Oh, Nibiru.
The screenshots are in Japanese. I just realized if you go to the materia or subsection, they're all in Japanese.
Nibelheim is spelled Niburuhelm. Nibiru. So you definitely have somebody who's going in there, doing their best with romanization of Japanese names.
Yes.
Some of them are great. Cosmo Canyon's there. You have Costa del Sol. Gongaga is the same. Cosmo Canyon. I think I said Cosmo Canyon twice.
That's okay.
But yeah, that's interesting. Interesting, look at, also what games magazines were like at the time, right? We, in the games media now, get such a kind of controlled asset dump from companies, especially for a game like Final Fantasy. For Final Fantasy VII Rebirth or for Final Fantasy 16, the publisher control over the assets and the communication of what you're allowed to put in your features or interviews is so nailed down by the publishers now. Whereas this is they got a Japanese copy of the game and then wrote a strategy guide based off one person's sort of interpretation of how to localize some of these names and stuff, which is wild. You'd never see that now.
Yeah, you would never see Utai
Utai, yeah.
Utai, Yuffie's hometown.
Yeah.
Just making stuff up. That's fine. Print it. Which it's again, I think part of that also speaks to some of the a little bit disposability of this.
Yes.
Like nobody was planning on you and me making this podcast in 20 odd years.
No, definitely not. Which is part of what Video Game History Foundation is sort of trying to solve with some of their recent digital archive stuff. Is this stuff was disposable? It was never really meant to last, but it's important, and it's so fascinating to be able to go through this and look at what the gaming culture and gaming industry was like at the time for a huge release like Final Fantasy VII, and how that differs from what we're looking at today. So I'm glad we can see this. It's cool. Like, I have a lot of these magazines physically because I kept them, but that doesn't help other people if they don't have access to it as well.
Right, and a lot of new people don't know, younger gamers do not know how these games were covered at the time, and then you see a lot of myths and stuff brought up around, one of the weirdest things on TikTok especially is seeing like 23, 24, 25-year-olds explain to 13, 14, 15-year-olds what life was like in the 90s, and just like, no, it wasn't, or that was true for like some people, but a lot of other people thought very differently or had very different experiences. And, so it's fascinating that this is all still here if you know where to look for it. I love digging into this, but I love having the context of it and how it informs, that legacy, because that's still in our brains, right? Reviews, previews, letter sections and everything. Like, modern content sites are still kind of structured like this.
Yeah. I've got one more Final Fantasy VII like preview thing. I'm scrolling through near to the end of the magazine, and maybe we touch on this later. If we touch on this later, you can cut this out, Ty. But
sure.
Near the end of the magazine, they have a top this section, and so they give you 3 challenges: challenge 1, challenge 2, challenge 3. And I think the second one, which is Final Fantasy VII, speaks to the experience that they had playing the game, probably in Japanese. The challenge is, can you beat our time for disc 1?
Huh.
And it says, here's a cool contest for all you RPG fans out there. We played through the first disc of Final Fantasy VII and finished it with a time just under 27 hours. Do you think you can beat it? 27 hours. When I play Final Fantasy VII now, I beat the first disc in probably like 7 hours.
10. Yeah. I was going to say 10
if I'm taking my time.
Yeah.
When back in the day, you were probably looking at, 12 to 15 hours. And so here's somebody being like, hey, I beat it in 27 hours. Think you can do better? Like, I played through Final Fantasy VII a year or two ago, and it took me like 42 hours total. And I was doing most of the side content. And so this was a different experience as well, because, there wasn't easy access, especially before games were out in the West, to guides and walkthroughs and like online communities existed. But if the game wasn't out, like, you were stumbling through in Japanese trying to figure out how to get through this game. Just like my friend who played Final Fantasy Tactics in Japanese, and it just takes forever. And the idea that the challenge would be to beat the first disc of Final Fantasy VII in under 27 hours.
Incredible. It's incredible.
Wild, and tells you a lot about like what gaming was like at the time.
All right, well, Aidan, I'm having 5 stars out of 5 stars worth of fun so far. Are you?
I'm having 5. Is 5 the max I can give it?
Yeah, well,
I'd go over 5. It's 10 out of 10
according to
stars.
Apple
10 out of 10 stars.
And
100
PSN.
out of 100 stars.
Yes.
That's where I'm at.
Okay, well, folks, if you are to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, 100 out of 5 stars, please. We will read the best, funniest, kindest, and most entertaining ones on the air.
A little bit of advice for reviews. If you mention your favorite host of Fun Factor, and if it's Aidan, we will definitely read your review online.
We absolutely will.
I'll probably link to it on Blue Sky. Take some screenshots.
All right.
So name your favorite host. If it's Aidan, extra exposure.
Future generations will know who the favorite is. When we get back, we review PSM number 1's review of Final Fantasy VII right here on Fun Factor. Okay, Aidan, it is time. We're reviewing the review, Final Fantasy VII, PSM number 1. First of all, we could probably do, there have been entire podcast series about replaying Final Fantasy VII. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but what's your history with 7? What did you think of it when you played it?
I discovered console RPGs with Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger and became a big fan on the Super Nintendo near the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan. And so Final Fantasy VII was, it was all me and my friends talked about. We read all the previews, we had all the issues, we were so excited for it. Only one of my friends could actually afford to get a PlayStation when it came out. And so one of my absolute core gaming memories in life is when we went to his house. So I grew up on a small island. So to get Final Fantasy and a PlayStation, we had to leave our island, catch a ferry, catch a bus ride that was 45 minutes up to the mall with a Sony store, get the PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII, pile back on the bus, all the way back down to our ferry, take the ferry, get home. So, we probably spent 5 hours getting a PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII, got back home, went to my friend's house, loaded it all up, played through that intro, and I just soaking in the glow of that CRT, watching Avalanche take down the Mako reactor. It sunk in with me in a way that pretty much nothing ever has matched in terms of just immersion in an experience, in a gaming experience. How it took the cinematic qualities of Final Fantasy VI and created something so much bigger and richer and more detailed is just incredible. And my relationship with 7 has gone up and down over the years. At the time, I felt like it was amazing. Then I went back and was like, oh, the localization's pretty crappy.
Yeah.
I feel like it, it's a pretty janky. I like this one or that one or whatever better. 9 is so much nicer looking or whatever.
Sure.
Then Rebirth remake trilogy came out. I revisited 7, and just looking at it from the perspective of the way that its story is so far ahead of its time, and honestly feels incredibly apt to the moment we're in with its sort of anti-capitalist, pro-environmentalism themes. I don't even call them themes because they're so overt in the text. They're not metatextual themes. They're the text. This game is just a anti-capitalist, pro-environmentalist takedown of corporate culture. I look back at it now and I'm like, man, that game was cooking in a way that nothing else at the time was. And the fact that they have this in a game in 1997 is remarkable. And is it still a little janky? Sure. But you load it up on a CRT on PlayStation, it's beautiful still. It's still fast and snappy in a way that some of the later games aren't. And the remake trilogy just renewed my love for the game, and it's not my favorite Final Fantasy, but it definitely went from sort of a bottom third to a top third Final Fantasy over the course of the past 5 years as I revisited it.
Yeah, I had kind of a similar experience. I had my own PlayStation, but I had a tight friend group, and we had the rich one, right? The guy who's family owned a small business, so he had and he had room to hang out. He had his own little mini apartment over the garage, basically. Oh my god! So at that point we'd all hang up out there, and we would take turns. We'd bring our memory cards. We'd be playing at home, but then come and hang out after school and
Yeah, we did a lot of that too.
But we had one guy who did not have a PlayStation, and so he would play only at the rich guy's house, and he was a little behind us, right? So we all get to the end of the first disc. This guy, he had renamed Aerith after that spring he had dated a German exchange student for the course of the spring.
This is gonna
and then
go well.
She went home, right? So this is the fall. We're playing it, and he is renamed Aerith after that girl.
Oh boy!
And I'm come in. I'm and I pull a couple of other guys aside. And I'm like, we have to tell him. They're like, what? No, it's spoiler. What? I'm like, no. It's gonna kill him. He's gonna die. You. you cannot have the character he's projecting his like long lost German girlfriend from 3 months ago onto have what happen, and so of course like literally it was like a couple days later I went over and he's onto the second disc, and like I think it had just happened when I got there, and I was like, "Hey Rob," and he looks at me and just like the dad eyes, I'm like, "Oh my god, dude!" Like
yeah. He didn't recover.
No.
And like those like, that was a big moment for everybody who played it, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the moments in gaming history. I think it has had such a tremendously profound impact on what a lot of people need and want the remake series to be.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
And I want it to be, I mean, we can spoil it, right?
Yeah, sure.
So like I think there's so many people like that poured so much and had so much emotional attachment to that moment when Aerith is killed by Sephiroth, that they needed the remake series to like fix them.
Yeah.
To come back and go back to 1997 when your friend's German girlfriend was, impaled by a 7-foot-long sword, and fix that moment of trauma. But the whole game, and especially the remake series, is about how trauma isn't fixed easily like that.
Yes.
There's no way to go back and just undo trauma. You have to learn to live in the world where it exists. And I think you can trace a lot of like, I don't know, like big feelings and big, like a lot of dudes especially, but I'm sure like girls and women went through the same thing, learning about their feelings, right? As 14-year-olds who fell in love probably for the first time with a video game character, and then Square was like, hold up. And we never really recovered, the same way Cloud never really recovers from that. And I think that's really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like there are games that tried to put the player in the role of, the main character in the game. But Final Fantasy really like pulled a nasty rug pull on the player by like really leaning into the idea like, hey, you're like, you love Aerith. Like,
right.
She's like, she's got a place in your heart and you love her, and you're going to feel this in a way that you haven't felt anything in a game before.
No.
And I think that shaped a lot of people's adolescent lives and expectations for stories and expectations for love and heroism and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. And an incredible moment. And I think it was interesting to me because then the back half of that, I felt, obviously I was also wowed by the technology, incredible storytelling, cinematic, lots of innovation. And I think we all kind of forgave. It was so ambitious how many things were janky or how many things fell a little bit flat. But the highs were unbelievable. I also thought that it, some of the stories at the time were like, oh my gosh, like they hired over 100 people to finish this game, which at the time was kind of ridiculous to staff up like that to generate enough art assets for a game. And now that's like medium to small.
Especially for like Square at the time was not planning for this to be a big worldwide hit. Like this was a Japanese game made for like a Japanese audience. So to scale up like to that level for a game that they didn't really have like major worldwide ambitions for, is even more remarkable. Because like at the time, like 100 doesn't sound like much now. Like we're at a place where BioWare just had a bunch of layoffs and they're down to like quote unquote just under 100 devs left over. As like meaning like that's like a skeleton crew for a company like that.
Yes.
Whereas like Square, like hiring up to like 100 devs or however many it was is like that was a lot at that time.
And I think
like
it showed, the seams showed in some of the project management, the fact that there's the in-game textureless characters, the battle scene characters that had the textures and realistic proportions. There was the chibi blocky ones. And then some of the cutscenes were chibi, blocky, high res. Some of them were more realistically modeled. Some of them were straight up.
Depending on like which like CG house did the cutscene. You'd get either the chibi models or you'd get like full on like rendered like realistically proportioned models, like no rhyme or reason.
Nope.
Just like you got one or the other. And that was it. And it was basically whoever got farmed out for that one particular scene. There was sort of that. And I like, to me, Final Fantasy VII, outside of the remarkable stuff it does with its story, I think it feels very much like a company that is finding its way in a really new version of the media. With all this space on the discs, all this new technology. Like Final Fantasy VIII feels like such a technical level up. Like it feels like a new generation almost, because they learned so much with 7 as they were feeling their way through. But in some ways that makes me like it even more looking back. You know, I like all the scenes. I like the ambition. I like that they didn't hold back and tried everything that they could. Because I think it feels scrappy in the way that Avalanche and Cloud's crew were scrappy and didn't really let up. They had to try everything, use everything at their disposal.
Yeah, and I like you, kind of went back to the remake. I'll say I also had this kind of, we're all on the couch and we're playing through, I think it was kind of the Cloud, what is it, Midial scenes, you know, in the second half, and like when Cloud is like, oh, I'm like whole again, I remember feeling, no, I still don't understand what happened. Like, no, I'm not, it doesn't, I don't get it, you know? And I kind of turned to my friends and I was like, okay, so this is the best Final Fantasy ever by a long shot, the best RPG ever by a long shot. But are we all in agreement this is not as good as 6 in terms of like, just as a game, like how the story is executed and story told and like start to finish, you know, and everybody kind of went, no, like 6 was better executed. Yeah. And the jank and some of this stuff and the localization, obviously, which we didn't know, all that stuff. So like that was kind of where I landed with it, which is like it's amazing, incredible, groundbreaking, revolutionary. You can still really see the seams and kind of the rush job and some of the stuff that fell flat. But going back and playing Remake and Rebirth so far, it surprised me how hard the characters hit, how much all the love and attention they put into those, like callback and every little single moment where I'm like, oh, I remember this from back then, you know, like the house as an enemy. Why did they make a house as an enemy? And then in Remake, the hell house is a boss, you know, and I've told you this before, Aidan, I've brought this up before, but when we were watching the intro cutscene to Remake, it's sweeping through and you see these shots, you know, and my oldest, who's 20 now, turns to me and goes, well, you did it. You made me nostalgic for your media. Great job.
Yeah. You said that to me in a feature I was working on.
Oh, yes, that's right.
I wrote for IGN about how Rebirth and Remake are sort of like uniting two generations, millennials and their kids. And we talked about that and how the new games so effectively tap into that nostalgia for millennial parents who played the games initially, and how just the new modern take on Final Fantasy allows younger gamers to be like, oh, okay, yeah, this is cool. I can see why you like it. In a way that like we couldn't show our kids Final Fantasy VII, the original, the OG, if they're not already sort of into that. Sort of game. Like I think one of your kids is like Xenogears and stuff, right? Like, you know, like there are younger kids who like those older games, but for the most part, if you try to show a random like Fortnite 20-year-old player Final Fantasy VII, they'd be like, this is awful. Like, what do you? Nothing anybody is saying makes sense. It's this or that or whatever. And so I think the Remake series does such a good job of that. And in that same article, I spoke with Naoki Hamaguchi, who helped make Rebirth and is part of the leadership group on the Remake series, and he talked about how what you're describing is sort of like the rough edges and the story bits that were like, this doesn't really explain how all of a sudden Cloud is better or whatever. Right. He recognized, and his team recognized, that those holes were opportunities to fill in the Remake series, that there were areas in the original game where it couldn't go far enough to tell its story, and that the Remake trilogy was an opportunity to say, okay, like this story was too ambitious for our understanding of the tech, our experience. How can we take the holes and fill them with something that feels not only like satisfying from a modern perspective, but creates a richer, fuller understanding of the story we wanted to tell initially, which I think is so interesting. You have so many remakes that either try to like slavishly emulate the original, or you have ones that feel like they need to like really create something new with a brand new identity. But the idea of going back and filling in holes in an existing property is so cool to me. And I think the new games do that really well. I'm a big fan of the remakes.
Me too. And that's a whole nother episode.
Yeah, I know.
Issue,
we're getting off track.
I'm sure people are like, aren't you going to review their review instead of reviewing those games and the remakes? Yeah. So PSM.
Let's review Game Informer like 392 or whatever, where they review remakes.
PSM used a 5-star system like the one I admired so much at their sister publication Next Generation. 5 stars, a PlayStation classic no fan should be without, a can't miss game no matter who you are. 4 stars, a really well done game. If you're a fan of the genre, you should check it out. 3 stars, a pretty good game. It has its share of rough spots, but some redeeming qualities as well. 2 stars, maybe worth a quick look if you're a diehard fan of the genre or license. Otherwise, don't bother. 1 star, don't even make eye contact with this one. It's not worth a second of your time. And then they have a really interesting tick where they have like few bullet point takeaways before the final score itself, and then the final score itself is accompanied by kind of like a log line, like a one-shot summary sentence. But Imagine Media was kind of doing this thing where they don't have bylines on the reviews, and this is also like that. We know Stephen Frost was the editor for the reviews, but we don't know who actually wrote each of these reviews, if it was freelancers, if it was all him, other contributors, whatever. So the review itself is only 257 words, and it was kind of interesting to me because the magazine, we've got 1 page for Final Fantasy VII, but that also includes the table of contents, the review metric, rubric, the header and stuff. The next page, 3 reviews on 1 page, 3 reviews on each of the page the rest of the way. So ultra game players usually had 1 page for a review or 2 for a bigger game, and the ultra game players that comes out the next month had 2 whole pages that was just Final Fantasy VII review, and it was much more in depth than this. Only 257 words, they basically do a pretty good job of summarizing the intro and everything else. But Aidan, I want you to, I'm going to put it in the chat here, just go ahead and read for me this section, because I think it really kind of gives just what we were at this time still in 1997 with RPGs.
Hundreds of beautifully rendered backgrounds were created for the game, and they gave each locale an eerie sense of realism. Mostly a mixture of low-tech and futuristic building designs, the architecture of the Final Fantasy is unique, at the very least. Each town has its share of residents that the game's characters interact with. Some will aid Cloud, while others will attempt to stop him. The only real dent in the armor is the lack of a Red Book audio soundtrack. Basically, all of the game's music is played through the PlayStation's MIDI chip. While adequate, this doesn't seem to do the game justice.
Okay, so first of all, I love each town. There's towns, and you'll walk from town to town, and some NPCs will aid Cloud, while others will attempt to stop him. Like, we're at this level of like how do RPGs work?
Groundbreaking. But 7 was positioned, and like this is the start of positioning Final Fantasy VII as like your first RPG.
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
Final Fantasy VI reached like 600,000 people in the West, in North America. Like Final Fantasy VII sold 10 million. So like that's potentially 9.4 million people who hadn't played an RPG before. Yeah. And stuff like this, and framing it in that way, I think is part of what helped it find that new audience. So it sounds silly to us, but I wonder if it's intentional as well, of trying to like say, hey, like, you know, you might not know what RPGs are all about, yes, but doesn't this sound enticing?
Yes. I also like, you know, and again, 257 words, and they put like 38 of them towards talking about the audio. No Red Book audio. It's all MIDI. You know, it's all through the sound chip. Doesn't do the game justice. But then the bullet points.
Yeah. I think.
Oh, go ahead.
That's like, honestly, like looking back, I'm surprised to see that criticism.
Me too.
Because I didn't think people were really like noticing or writing about that sort of thing. I know Red Book audio and streaming audio on the PlayStation was a selling point, but I didn't think people like really noticed or cared, outside of like all my friends cared about was that we could put Lunar in our CD player and listen to the music.
Yes.
You know, like we didn't actually really know or understand the consequences of having like streaming audio. And like, when looking back at Final Fantasy VII, like Uematsu, who did the score, recognizes that not doing streaming audio was a mistake that he made.
Right.
And it might even have been, I can't remember, Uematsu or Sakaguchi, and saying like they wanted to avoid loading times.
Yes.
Where the game was having to stream audio in or buffer it in RAM. And so they went with the MIDI chip tunes. And then they saw Suikoden, which did streaming audio, and its sound quality and its music quality was just so much higher. And they went, okay, we should have done that. we should have eaten the like additional loading times and just done streaming music, because it's such a stronger audio, like not visual, but like audio experience for the player. And Final Fantasy VII has a great soundtrack, but the execution of it on the PlayStation is not good. It sounds bad. And so I'm pretty impressed actually to see that they spent any time talking about the audio quality and the sound quality of that game.
Yeah, and then it's contradicted. This is the funny part to me, because these review to review,
I know, in the little
bullet points, right? So you get 4 takeaways. The graphics are heavenly. The music is classic Final Fantasy VII orchestra. And I want to point out here, it does say FFVII, classic FFVII orchestra, which, I mean, they're not wrong, but clearly that was a typo. Also worth pointing out, there are multiple typos in this review. The concept redefines RPGs. I'll play it for months with no sleep. And then they give it 5 stars, and a standard setting game no gamer should miss. So, and this isn't the only time, just from my memory, I remember sometimes the text of the review and then these bullet points would contradict, sometimes directly, like this. The music is classic. Yeah. Like, you just said that the only thing is that the audio is not that good. So, like, and again, not wrong, right? You can both critique its lack of streamed audio from the CD and say the music is incredible, because the Final Fantasy music is incredible. 7 music is incredible and iconic, but just that kind of cognitive dissonance feels like, I think it kind of belies you had a contractor or freelancer or some other staff member write this review, and then the editor went through and like boop, 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 and then, cool, summarized.
And like, who knows, maybe the initial draft was like, hey, like the actual orchestration and the composition from Uematsu is beautiful and some of the best the series has ever had. However, the real dent in the armor is the lack of Red Book audio soundtrack, which doesn't do the compositions justice, and as somebody who writes, and gets edited all the time, I can see how the editor probably wrote those bullet points, or the initial author wrote those bullet points. The editor came in, cut out the stuff about the composition being great, left the stuff about the Red Book audio, and forgot to update the bullet points, right? And so you can see how the wires get crossed through a process that's probably, not as comprehensive, or was maybe rushed or a little faster than it should have been.
So I thought it would be kind of fun. I went back and looked at the Ultra Game Players review. That was a 9.7 out of 10. This is a 5. I was kind of wondering if there would be a review that was like talking about some of the janky story, or, I did find a couple of contemporary things that mentioned kind of the localization, but that was usually in more of a in-depth feature versus this actual review. It was so far ahead of its time in so many ways that it feels like that technical achievement overshadowed what I think were pretty obvious flaws at the time. But then how the game is remembered and everything. It's just fascinating to look back on that to me.
It is. And like, I don't know if me and my friends picked up on the localization being bad at the time. Like, I don't remember any of that. I think it was just so impressive in a lot of ways that, the audio visual stuff, the graphics, the cinematics, the settings, the pre-rendered backgrounds, like it all just kind of smacked you over the head so hard that maybe we just didn't really notice or care about the rest of it.
I will say,
I felt like
I meant to clip this out.
Everybody loved Aerith.
Yeah, everybody loved Aerith. Everybody loved Tifa. I was a Tifa guy from the beginning. But the Ultra Game Players
Tifa's
review,
great in the remake.
Oh yeah.
I feel like the remake executes on what I felt Tifa was lacking in the original, as like that sort of third pillar in Cloud's life. Because I don't think that's there in the original game in the way that it is in the remake, and so anyway, that's an argument for another.
Sure. But like the Ultra Game Players review actually called out its big thing that surprised me was talking about Barrett's dialogue and the translation and going, okay, he's like walking around talking like Mr. T. And like, this is really kind of like, wow, this dude is like a stereotype. Which again, I was surprised and pleased to see called out. I also remember like the T for Teen rating, being shocked when characters could say shit, and then being equally shocked when characters said $, £, at blah 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 blah. You know, it's like, well, can you say shit or not? Can you say damn or not?
Yeah.
Like, how did I don't understand? You know, and like, you know, there are big dramatic moments, and then people are talking in, you know, gobbledygook that, you know, is a swear word, and then, you know,
there's like some intentionality behind the localization to like get that stuff through or create a stereotype out of Barrett, but then not enough intentionality to like nail the really important stuff.
Yeah,
which is weird.
Very strange. So yeah, I mean, 5 out of 5, 10 out of, like, everybody's giving this game huge scores for reasons. I thought it was kind of fun flipping through the rest of this. Resident Evil also gets 5 out of 5. Super Street Fighter Collection, mentioned earlier, also gets 5 out of 5. Ace Combat gets 5 out of 5. Namco Museum Volume 4 gets a 2, which I was surprised to see a 2 in the opening issue. Good for them. You know, but it was basically like, this is a really random collection of arcade games to like Pac-Land. We were not crying out for this. There's like a half decent Pac-Man in here, but you've played Pac-Man.
The little bullet points are great. Looks like you made the games yourself.
Damn,
it's so good.
Damn.
The best thing, and I think it deserved a 3. It should have got an extra point because the Namco Museum collections, there are 5 of them, and each one had a different letter from the word Namco on the front cover of the case. So, or I guess it would be the manual. So like you had the first one was NAMCO. So you line up side by side. If you got all of them, it spells Namco. And that to me is like a baseline 1. Doesn't matter what's on the disc. If you've put that level of effort into your presentation, you get a 1 at least. So I think they got that 2 wrong on Namco Museum, even if Pac-Land is sort of the lead game on the collection.
So flip the page and hey, cut a great deal at Sears, and there's Cloud with the Buster Sword. Clip this coupon.
Oh, the shirt.
Yeah, clip this coupon. Take it to any Sears Funtronics department for 1 t-shirt and $10 off the regular price of Final Fantasy VII. I did get the shirt because I pre-ordered it at Software Etc. I do still have the shirt. I think I wore it to go buy Remake.
Rebirth.
Or I think I wore it on Remake Day. I bought it digitally or whatever, but like I wore it just to make sure. I'm like, yo, which was great. And then one last highlight I wanted to hear: Battle Arena Toshinden, which we reviewed this review in another episode. I don't know if we're gonna. It was kind of our first proto episode 0.5. We'll probably get to that at some point. It got 4.5 stars from their original score, quote unquote. I guess that's from gameplay.
They're like, this is issue 1.
Yeah, this is issue 1. Yeah, I don't know where but I think they're like, well, we would have given it 4.5 stars at release. New score 3.
4.5 down to 3. I guess they played Toshinden 2.
Right.
My favorite though is next to it is Jumping Flash 2, which its original score 4.5 stars, new score 4.5 stars. So like
nothing's
changed, guys. You couldn't have found a different game that, you know, like you realize like, oh, we missed the mark on here. We gave Suikoden a 3 and we should have given it a 4.
What's really great for me on the Battle Arena Toshinden, it's like, what changed? The answer is nothing. It's like it's still a pretty good game that can hold its weight with today's heavy hitters. They say so only complimentary things, and then dock a 1.5.
Yeah, even by today's standards, the 3D character movements have yet to be surpassed.
Both new and longtime PlayStation owners should definitely check it out. Screw you, 3 stars. Like what?
It's like 33% of the stars. Like they knock that score down by 33%.
And I think insane. That is just, you know, kind of reflects the recency bias. Like anything new must be better because it's new, because we're so excited. You know, the technology is pushing so far forward. The like, let alone retro, right? It's like what is coming out last year is like last year.
Yeah. I guess like it's kind of like this game, Toshinden, they have a release date of September 1995. So earlier I was talking about how like PlayStation fever hadn't really kicked in, and like, you know, hardcore PlayStation fans didn't really exist at the time. But like, I guess 2 years later, I feel like at that time it was still trying to find its way, but maybe that was just me because I was a big RPG fan, and my friends, we were just RPG fans. So we played stuff like Toshinden and the original Jumping Flash, like here and there, but it didn't really cement itself as like the game console we needed until 97.
We're also rounding into hey, there are different consoles that do different things.
Yeah.
If you were a Nintendo kid for life, or if you were a Sega diehard coming out of the console wars, but nobody was like, I don't want to say nobody. I don't think you had the same, like, oh, you have to be you could be a PlayStation fanatic, but you weren't a Sony fanatic.
No.
Because your Walkman was Sony, your TV was Sony, your stereo was Sony, Sony, there were so many Sony things. Sony didn't feel like it was yours or ours, I think, in that same way that Nintendo or Sega. And like you said, that like maybe people were like, yeah, PlayStation is the best console. I've got a PlayStation. It's the best. It's better than Saturn. Well, you got a Saturn, blah, 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 blah. But that's maybe why there weren't the PlayStation tattoos or the PlayStation, it wasn't the Sony ride or die in that same way.
And there wasn't kind of that like parasocial association with Sony the way that Nintendo and Sega like really developed through a lot of advertising and stuff too, right? Like there was like direct like console wars in magazines where they were trying to kind of steal people's like brand loyalty away. And PlayStation wasn't doing that. They were kind of like, hey, games are for not just children anymore. We're going to position ourselves as a console that's for, grown-ups or young adults or, people who are in their early 20s in a way that like Nintendo hadn't really caught up with yet. Because like I'm looking at this backlog, which is where they give a bunch of stars to, what was it, every PlayStation game, did you say? Not every, but like a bunch of them. There's like a bunch of good games in there that, my friends and I, like, we really got into the PlayStation when, like I said, that one friend got a PlayStation for Final Fantasy VII, but we knew other people who had them. And so we would go over to their houses and we'd play stuff. We played Cool Borders and Crash Bandicoot. Right? We played stuff like, I remember playing the Jet Moto demo a ton, and stuff like that. Like there are good games on here, which were fun. Loaded was fun. They gave 5 stars to Soul Blade, Suikoden. Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo was a big one that we played a lot. Tobal Number 1, Tomb Raider, Wild Arms, Wipeout. So we were definitely playing these games, but when, you asked me at the beginning of the episode, it's like, oh no, PlayStation started with Final Fantasy VII. Like that was the beginning of like its existence in my head canon. Even though like I had all these experiences with these other games and played them a ton at other people's houses. But it didn't really like infiltrate our friend group as like the thing that we talked about until Final Fantasy VII came along.
Okay. So Aidan, that's their reviews section. Should we go ahead and review the actual review of Final Fantasy VII?
All right, man. Let's do it. Let's do this thing.
All right, cool. Yeah. I was thinking we could use like a custom scale for everything, right? So I'm going to give this review 6 out of 10 Buster Swords.
6 out of 10 Buster Swords. I like it. I got to say, even one Buster Sword is like pretty cool. Like if you've got a Buster Sword, Cloud Strife, one Buster Sword, pretty cool.
Sure.
So 6 out of 10, not bad. Right in the middle. I think you're kind of spot on there. I might give it a 7, maybe even an 8. I think it's a pretty good sort of consumer centric buyer's guide style review. It tells you what the game is. It tells you what it does well and why it's special. When I go back and I think about this period of my life, though, there are reviews that have like been burned into my soul that I read a million times that informed, my personality at, like there's a Chrono Trigger review in a Game Player's issue that like I must have read 300 times, right? I'd read it every night before bed. When it comes to these big, like, genre-changing, industry-changing, life-changing games like Final Fantasy VII, that's kind of what I want from that review. I want something that I, like, sink my teeth into, and it is the feature for that issue of that magazine. That's not what this review is. This review is fine. It's well-written. It's well-presented. It presents Final Fantasy VII's strengths well. So I'm going to give it, a median, like, good review score, 7 Buster Swords out of 10, which is good. 7 Buster Swords. I don't even think Cloud could carry 7 Buster Swords, but it's good. It's good. It's
no, not.
It's not super punchy. It's not super memorable, but it absolutely does its job of telling you what Final Fantasy VII was and what it did well.
Yeah, and as we talked about, it did give us the highs and the lows. I just went back and looked at, the Ultra Game Players review, a couple other reviews, and went, man, there was 2 pages, right? Like, they really gave it the heft. And if you're launching a PlayStation magazine, it looks like they had a huge, maybe I should give them credit for the huge walkthrough, the huge feature. But it seems like they knew this was going to be a giant game. And, again, they also had the big backlog of games. They're rating all the games that they didn't get a chance to rate. They're doing all this stuff for number 1, but overall, as it stands in a vacuum, I just think it's a little too middle of the road. Doesn't stand out, like you say, doesn't have enough depth to it. Hints at some things. We also have, again, the contradictory bullet points. So I'm willing to go up to 7 with you, but I think that's my limit. So yeah, all right, let's go 7 out of 10. We will give it 7 out of 10 Buster Swords. That is our review of PSM 100% Independent PlayStation Magazine's review of Final Fantasy VII. Did we get it right? Leave a review at Apple Podcasts. Post it as a comment on YouTube. We will read the best ones on air. And hey, go ahead, pass this show around to all your friends like it's 3rd grade and we're on the playground. But unlike these old magazines, you won't have to wait a whole month for the next installment. We're dropping new episodes every 2 weeks. So subscribe, follow however you check out your podcast. Follow us on Blue Sky at Fun Factor Pod, and please consider becoming a member by supporting us directly at funfactorpod.com. Remember, now you've got the fun factor.